The Panama Canal has long served as a critical trade route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and facilitating the movement of trillions of dollars in cargo. However, it has recently faced significant challenges that have raised concerns, even prompting Elon Musk to weigh in on the matter. Once controlled by the United States, the canal was handed over to Panama in 1999. Since then, rising fees and tensions, including a notable threat from Donald Trump, have caused discontent among shipping companies. These developments have led to questions about what's really going on, prompting a deeper exploration of the situation. On December 22, Donald Trump provided a glimpse of his stance on the Panama Canal during a rally in Arizona, making headlines with his bold statements. He criticized Panama for imposing what he described as exorbitant fees on American ships using the canal. His remarks shocked many, with Trump arguing that these rising costs were making it increasingly difficult for American businesses to transport goods between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, negatively impacting the U.S. economy. Trump went as far as suggesting that if Panama didn't reduce these fees, the United States might consider reclaiming control of the canal. This startling proposal included a warning to Panamanian officials to be guided accordingly. The implications of such a move are profound, as the Panama Canal plays a pivotal role in international trade. As one of the busiest shipping routes in the world, any further fee increases could have far-reaching consequences for global commerce. Trump also highlighted concerns about countries like China benefiting from the current fee structure, suggesting that the high costs allowed China to maintain a competitive edge while American businesses face disadvantages. In response, the president of Panama, José Raúl Mulino, firmly rejected Trump's remarks. He emphasized that Panama maintains full control over the canal and has no intention of relinquishing it to the United States or engaging in negotiations with Trump on the matter. His strong stance underscored the sovereignty Panama exercises over this vital waterway, sparking an intense exchange of opinions. Amid the escalating debate, Elon Musk, known for his innovative ventures and influence over U.S. government spending, offered his perspective on the issue. Sources close to Musk suggest that he believes Panama's decision to raise fees stems from several challenges it faces. These include a lack of fresh water, political tensions, security concerns, and other operational difficulties that have driven up the costs of maintaining the canal. Musk proposed that the fee hikes might not be part of a broader conspiracy but rather a reflection of Panama's efforts to address its financial struggles and sustain the canal's operations. The situation underscores the complex dynamics surrounding the Panama Canal, a crucial asset for global trade. With various stakeholders voicing their concerns and interests, the future of this vital waterway remains a topic of intense discussion and speculation. Elon Musk's comments might make sense from a business perspective, but they didn't exactly calm the situation. For many people, especially Trump supporters, his remarks were seen as another instance of him being, well, Trump. For others, however, the situation felt like more than just a few harsh words. It seemed like a direct threat to another country's sovereignty. The backlash wasn't limited to Americans either. Panama's response was particularly intense, with President Mulino openly expressing his strong disapproval of Trump's remarks. This strong reaction caught many by surprise, hinting at deeper underlying tensions. The issue, it turns out, is rooted in a long and complex history between Panama and the United States, a history that stretches back more than 500 years, long before the Panama Canal even came into existence. To grasp the full weight of the current tensions, it's necessary to go back to 1513. That was the year when Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa made a groundbreaking discovery. As he crossed the Isthmus of Panama, he realized that this narrow strip of land connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This discovery sparked a vision among explorers who imagined the potential of creating a passage between the two oceans. Balboa's idea, shared with others, was revolutionary. It proposed a waterway that could dramatically reduce the time needed for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. During that era, navigating the southern tip of South America was an incredibly treacherous ordeal. The seas were notoriously rough, and many ships attempting the journey never returned. Those that did brought back chilling accounts of violent storms, perilous waters, and encounters with what sailors believed were sea monsters. Given the dangers, the idea of a shortcut became even more appealing, and many explorers embraced the concept. However, despite the enthusiasm, actual progress was slow. The primary obstacle was the lack of advanced technology needed to create such a canal. The tools and machinery available at the time weren't sufficient for the enormous task of cutting through the land. Adding to the difficulty was the challenging terrain. The region was covered in dense jungles, marked by towering mountains, and plagued by an unforgiving tropical climate. The harsh conditions proved overwhelming for most of the explorers, who were unaccustomed to such an environment. It quickly became evident that building the canal was a far more complex endeavor than initially imagined. While the vision of a canal persisted, the execution would have to wait until technology and resources could catch up with the ambition. For centuries, the dream of a canal lay dormant. It wasn't until the late 19th century, over 300 years after Balboa's death, that anyone truly attempted to bring it to life. In 1881, a group of French explorers took on the challenge, inspired by advancements in technology that made the monumental task seem achievable. The French, having recently completed the Suez Canal in Egypt, saw this as a huge engineering success and set their sights on Panama, believing they could build a similar sea-level canal there. Armed with the right equipment and technical expertise, they faced the same unforgiving terrain that had defeated earlier efforts. The project to build the Panama Canal was initially led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French engineer renowned for his success with the Suez Canal. His earlier achievement fueled optimism that constructing a canal in Panama would be a straightforward endeavor. However, this confidence was misplaced. From the outset, the project was plagued with challenges. Workers began falling ill almost immediately, succumbing to malaria and yellow fever. The tropical environment proved brutal, with diseases spreading rapidly. Within weeks, large numbers of workers had died, and it became evident that Ferdinand and his team had underestimated the challenges they faced. The climate posed one of the greatest obstacles. Panama's tropical weather brought heavy rain, frequent landslides, and swarms of mosquitoes. These insects carried deadly diseases that decimated the workforce. Unlike the dry, arid conditions of Egypt, the dense jungle of Panama presented uneven slopes and thick vegetation, making it far more difficult to navigate and excavate than the flat desert terrain of the Suez project. Costs spiraled out of control as the toll of disease, the harsh terrain, and the specialized equipment required to manage these challenges made the project significantly more expensive than anticipated. Corruption among higher-ups further compounded the problems, draining resources and leaving the project in disarray. Expenses soared while progress remained sluggish, turning the effort into a financial disaster. By 1889, just 8 years after it began, the project collapsed completely. Over 20,000 workers had died, funds were exhausted, and little progress had been made. The endeavor was officially abandoned by December 1889, leaving behind a legacy of failure and heartbreak. Despite the French catastrophe, less than 20 years later, the United States took on the monumental challenge under the leadership of John Stevens, a renowned civil engineer known for his ability to deliver results. Efforts to construct the Panama Canal were revived, but the question remained, could Stevens succeed where so many had failed, or would he join the long list of those who had tried and fallen short? At the dawn of the 20th century, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt became deeply invested in completing the Panama Canal. He recognized the immense potential of having a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, not just for trade but also for military strategy. The canal promised a faster route for transporting goods and troops, making it a valuable asset for both commercial and military purposes. However, there was a significant obstacle: the canal zone did not belong to the United States. While constructing the canal was one challenge, obtaining control over it was another. For Roosevelt's vision to succeed, the U.S. needed legal rights to the canal zone, a hurdle that previous countries attempting the project had failed to overcome. Around the same time, Panama was engaged in a struggle for independence from Colombia. The U.S. saw this as an opportunity to intervene. Panama's independence movement faced significant challenges, and Roosevelt believed that supporting it could result in a mutually beneficial outcome. In 1903, the U.S. provided political and financial backing to Panama's independence efforts. With this support, Panama agreed to sign a treaty granting the U.S. control over the canal zone. This agreement effectively gave the United States the authority to build and manage the canal in exchange for financial aid. The treaty was signed in 1903, and by 1904, construction of the canal was underway. This time, However, the French were no longer in charge. The United States took over the project and brought in John Stevens, an American civil engineer known for his exceptional management skills and ability to handle large-scale projects under pressure. Stevens approached the project with lessons learned from past failures, particularly those of Ferdinand de Lesseps and his French team. Rather than immediately focusing on physical excavation, Stevens prioritized the well-being of his workforce, understanding that a healthy workforce was essential for success. He ensured that workers had decent housing, proper sanitation, and access to medical care. Diseases such as malaria and yellow fever had devastated the French workforce in earlier attempts, and Stevens was determined to prevent a similar outcome. He enlisted top medical professionals from the U.S. military to manage health risks and control the spread of diseases, creating a safer and more productive environment for the project to progress. Stevens wasn't solely focused on the well-being of the workers. He also recognized the immense challenge of constructing a sea-level canal in such difficult terrain. The landscape was characterized by steep slopes and deep valleys, making it an incredibly expensive and time-consuming endeavor to level it all out. Acknowledging these challenges, Stevens and his team of engineers made a pivotal decision to abandon the idea of a sea-level canal, which the French had previously attempted. Instead, they opted to build a lock-based system. This innovative approach involved lifting ships to a higher elevation at one point of the canal and lowering them back down at another, effectively bypassing the need to excavate through the steep hills. By leveraging the natural features of the land, this lock system not only reduced costs but also streamlined the construction process. Although it was still a demanding task, it was undoubtedly a more practical solution than previous efforts. By 1906, the project had made significant progress, but there was still an enormous amount of work to be done. However, the challenges were far from over. Tensions began to rise between Stevens and the U.S. government, particularly with President Theodore Roosevelt. Initially, the administration had been highly supportive, providing the necessary resources and backing to launch the project. But by the end of the year, this support appeared to shift into interference. Reports suggest that Roosevelt pressured Stevens to hire a contractor he distrusted, while others indicate the president was dissatisfied with some of Stevens' recent decisions regarding the project's management. Regardless of the reasons, the relationship between Stevens and the government was visibly deteriorating. The breaking point came when Stevens, already under immense pressure and dealing with the relentless strain of managing such a massive project in harsh conditions, fell ill due to stress. This provided the U.S. government with an opportunity to replace him. However, Stevens preempted their move by resigning in 1907, stepping down as chief engineer and passing the leadership to George Washington Goethals. George Washington Goethals assumed control of the Panama Canal project. Many anticipated a fresh perspective and a shift in direction. However, Goethals largely continued the work that Stevens had initiated. He and his team employed the same methods, such as using steam shovels and dynamite to tackle the challenging Culebra Cut, one of the most difficult sections of the canal. Despite these efforts, the task was far from easy. The terrain was treacherous, and even with advanced excavation techniques, they faced persistent setbacks due to equipment failures and the monumental challenge of moving vast amounts of earth. Despite the measures Stevens and Goethals implemented to combat disease, such as assembling top-tier medical teams to fight yellow fever, the health conditions for workers remained dire. Nearly 5,000 workers lost their lives to yellow fever and malaria during the project. In addition to disease, landslides and adverse weather conditions frequently disrupted progress. Workers would spend weeks carving out sections of the canal, only for a minor rainfall to undo their efforts by filling the excavated areas with mud. The setbacks were disheartening, but Goethals and his team remained steadfast and refused to give up. They kept pushing forward, determined to make the 500-year-old dream of a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific a reality. Finally, after a decade of struggles, setbacks, and unimaginable challenges, the Panama Canal was completed on August 15, 1914. The SS Ancon, a U.S. cargo ship, became the first vessel to officially pass through the canal. This moment was monumental not just for the U.S. but also for Panama. The canal was going to change everything. Before the canal, moving between the Atlantic and Pacific took about 2 months, an absolute nightmare for trade and military operations. With the canal now in place, it only took about 8 hours to travel between the two oceans. That was a massive difference, giving the US a significant advantage in both commerce and military strategy. What made this achievement even more remarkable was the diversity of the workforce. Workers came from all over the world, including experienced laborers from the Caribbean, uniting to make the canal a reality. It wasn't just an American achievement, it was a global effort. From the moment the Panama Canal opened, it was under US control. The United States didn't just have authority over the canal itself, they owned the entire area surrounding it, giving them a major strategic advantage. President Theodore Roosevelt had seen the canal as a vital piece of military infrastructure, especially as global tensions began to rise and World War I loomed on the horizon. The US military quickly recognized the canal's importance and used it as a vital shipping route to transport supplies for the war effort. Even after the war ended, the US maintained control of the canal zone. The canal was essential not just for military purposes but also for trade. Over the years, the US continued to invest in its infrastructure, making improvements to accommodate larger ships, including the massive Seawise Giant, which, despite its size, never actually passed through the canal. Nevertheless, countries from all over the world were eager to use the canal, as it made shipping between the Atlantic and Pacific much faster and more efficient. Due to its strategic location and high traffic, Panama benefited significantly from the US presence. They received generous compensation from the United States for allowing control of the area. For decades, the US held sovereignty over the canal and its surrounding region, but this arrangement was not destined to last forever. In the 1960s and 1970s, Panama began to challenge US control, and the situation took a significant turn when Omar Torrijos became president. Torrijos was not a typical politician, he deeply loved his country and was prepared to fight for Panama's sovereignty, no matter the cost. He believed Panama should have full control over its land, which meant ending the Hay-Buenaventura Treaty that had granted the US ownership of the canal zone in exchange for financial compensation. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Panama Canal, one driven by Panama's determination to reclaim its land and sovereignty. Omar Torrijos wasn't about to let Panama remain under the shadow of US control forever. He and his people were determined to gain complete sovereignty over every inch of their land, including the Panama Canal, a massive symbol of American influence. Torrijos knew that the canal was vital to Panama's future, both economically and politically, and he wasn't going to settle for anything less than full control. Starting in the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, Torrijos began intense negotiations with US President Richard Nixon. To say the talks were tense would be an understatement. Both sides had strong feelings about the canal and its strategic importance. But after years of back and forth, they finally reached an agreement in 1977. This was when the Torrijos-Carter treaties were signed, which granted Panama more legal rights over the canal. The US still had a significant presence and influence, but it was a step in the right direction for Panama. Over the next 2 decades, Panama's control over the canal continued to grow. They gained more rights with the ultimate goal of full ownership. Every year, Panama's position became stronger, and the US presence slowly diminished. Finally, on December 31, 1999, Panama officially gained full control and ownership of the canal, marking the end of an era. The canal was now Panama's to manage, and it was a massive win for the country. But even though the handover was a huge milestone, tensions were far from over. Once Panama gained full control of the canal in 1999, they didn't waste any time making some major changes. The first thing they did was raise the fees that shipping companies had to pay to use the canal. And this wasn't just a small bump, it was a big one. The tolls almost doubled, which definitely made waves in the shipping industry, especially among American companies like Maersk Line and COSCO Shipping. These companies weren't just any players, they were huge contributors to the US economy, moving tons of cargo between oceans. The Panamanian government argued that the hike was necessary to fund maintenance and improvements to the canal. They pointed out that the infrastructure needed to be upgraded to handle bigger ships in the future, which would, in turn, benefit everyone. But, of course, the shipping companies weren't thrilled about this. They grumbled about the higher fees, but at the end of the day, they had no choice but to pay up. Over time, the shipping companies got used to the higher fees, though they definitely didn't like it. But the story didn't end there. As the years went on, the tolls kept rising. By the mid-2000s, the situation was getting out of hand. The shipping companies were not happy, and some even started holding private meetings with the Panama Canal Authority to figure out ways to make the tolls more affordable. It was clear that something needed to change. The Panamanian government wasn't backing down. Then came 2016, when the Panama Canal Authority hit everyone with another massive price increase. This time, it was too much for many companies to swallow, and the backlash was even louder. US shipping companies were especially vocal, criticizing the increases and calling for some kind of solution. The tolls were climbing faster than anyone had expected, and with no signs of slowing down, it felt like the canal's growing costs were becoming a serious issue for American businesses. When the Panama Canal Authority was asked why they kept raising the tolls, their answer was pretty straightforward: they needed the extra cash to fund the ongoing expansion project. They had promised that the canal would be upgraded, and by the end of 2016, the project was finally completed. The canal was bigger, better, and ready to handle even more traffic, especially with the new set of locks designed for larger ships. However, as expected, the tolls didn't return to their previous rates before the project began. In fact, the price hikes just kept coming. By early 2020, the toll increases were still not slowing down. For instance, in 2023, any ship under 65 feet had to pay over 10% more just to pass through. It didn't stop there. By 2025, the fees were expected to jump by almost 30%. Shipping companies had no choice but to accept the new rates, even though they weren't happy about it. Many people started to realize that under US control, tolls had mostly stayed the same for nearly 4 decades. It wasn't until Panama took full control that prices started to climb, particularly after the 1970s. This shift in pricing didn't sit well with many and eventually led to some heated discussions, one of the biggest moments being when Donald Trump decided to speak out about it. When Donald Trump spoke out about Panama, he didn't hold back. He accused the Panamanian government of overcharging shipping companies using the canal and even went as far as threatening to take control of the waterway if they didn't stop. He suggested that Panama was playing favorites with China, implying that the Chinese government might be influencing Panama's decisions regarding the canal. It wasn't just about the tolls anymore, it seemed like Trump was getting at something bigger. The Panamanian government wasn't pleased with Trump's comments. President José R. Mulino came out swinging, defending Panama's sovereignty over the canal. He made it clear that Panama had full control and that there was absolutely no outside influence, especially not from China. As far as he was concerned, the matter was settled, and there were no plans to renegotiate with the US about the canal. The country wasn't about to give up its rights to the waterway or let anyone push them around. Mulino didn't just stop there. He also addressed Trump's complaints about the rising toll fees, explaining that the price increases weren't arbitrary. They were carefully calculated by experts who took into account the cost of operations, maintenance, and market conditions. The fees were necessary to keep the canal running smoothly, ensuring that it would continue to be a sustainable resource for both Panama and the shipping companies. It was pretty predictable that Elon Musk would have something to say about all this drama with the Panama Canal. As the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, it was his job to look into issues like these and make sure everything was running as smoothly and efficiently as possible. After taking a deep dive into the situation from both sides, Elon didn't hold back. According to him, things had been a bit of a mess for the Panama Canal in recent years. Compared to how things were back in the 1960s, the canal has been dealing with serious environmental issues like water shortages and droughts. This has made it harder for big ships to get through, and things only got worse in 2019, when the dry season lasted much longer than expected with almost no rain. With the climate looking like it's only going to get more unpredictable, the Panama Canal Authority had to find new ways to keep things running. But these adjustments, while necessary, made everything slower, which in turn made the canal harder and more expensive to maintain. The longer ships took to pass through, the more stress it put on the locks, which were already starting to wear out faster. But it wasn't just the weather causing problems. The pandemic in 2020 threw a huge wrench into things as well. With countries closing borders and factories shutting down, goods were stuck in limbo, meaning way less revenue was flowing into the canal. Even now, the canal is still feeling the effects of that slowdown. To make up for the lost revenue, they've had to increase tolls, and it looks like they'll keep going up for the foreseeable future. The problem with this, Elon pointed out, is that the canal's infrastructure is getting old. Over half of it is more than 100 years old. Sure, they've made some upgrades and expansions since 2016, but they are just putting a band-aid on the bigger issues. The canal is still running on infrastructure that wasn't built to handle modern traffic, and the situation isn't getting any better. To really future-proof the canal, they'd need some serious upgrades, but that would cost a fortune. If they decide to fund those upgrades by jacking up tolls even more, shipping companies are going to bail. Already, the price hikes have been getting complaints from companies, including American giants like MK Line and Costco Shipping. Elon's worried that if the canal keeps raising fees, fewer and fewer companies will be willing to pay. Even if they had the money to fix everything, the process would take years, just like it did when the canal was originally built. It took about a decade back then, and even with today's technology, it'd still take a long time. What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to Expedition Diaries for more videos.